Hey class, isn't it so interesting to consider the modern theories of child development as we look at children's literature? In our textbook, David Russell does an excellent job of breaking down three really important people and their ideas: Piaget, Erikson, and Kohlberg. And I think it's nice how in each of the sections he'll talk about why, for instance, tactile books, sensory books would be good for certain age groups, or chapter books with more mature topics. And I even was thinking about in sections when it talked about, oh, peer pressure becomes important, friendships become important, that narratives that involve friendships and pairings are more essential and interesting to those developing readers. But in my preparation for designing this literature for children course, I kept running into a really important distinction. This is a literature course. If it were a child development course, we would dive more deeply into those different theorists and we would analyze books with those theorists in mind. And that is fun, and it will probably happen just naturally because of our interests or fascination with that knowledge. But instead of thinking about child development so overtly, so for instance, if you're writing a children's book, you might be thinking, okay, I want to write to a 3-year-old, and a 3-year-old, we know this about how 3-year-olds experience the world, so I'm going to match my book to that knowledge of what the 3-year-old experience is like. A lot of literary experts posed this idea that, yes, we have that research, we have some knowledge to be able to do that work, but quite frankly, we are not children. And so we are researching outside of our experience. We've been children, but we no longer are. So a literary perspective that's potentially more fruitful or more interesting is to ask, what does this book, let's say, this artifact of literature for children, reveal about the author's assumptions about childhood? And maybe those assumptions are rooted in modern child development theories. So maybe we say Jane Doe, author, clearly has a working knowledge of what the contemporary psychological research says about the 3-year-old's experience because her book fits that experience really well. But there are other things, other assumptions hidden in texts, and you can almost imagine a book as a time capsule, and it captures our attitudes for that specific moment. So if a book was published in 1945, for instance, you'll find attitudes about what childhood is, what we perceive it to be like, but also what we want it to be like. And those are all encapsulated in the book. And that's the lens that I want you to really take on. The person who I most directly borrowed this perspective from, this way of looking at children's literature with a literary perspective, is a professor of children's literature at Berkeley University. Her name is Grace Lavery. And she went on to notice how a lot of children's literature of our current day, 21st century, has to or tends to position children as the leaders of an army, like they're a soldier of some kind. Take, for instance, and this is a little bit more young adult lit than children's literature, but still, take, for instance, The Hunger Games or Harry Potter. And what we could have a conversation about, is that these authors believe that maybe it's an element of wanting to set children up for fighting the good fight or making the world a better place. I find that even in David Russell's textbook. There's a comment at the very end of the chapter, I wrote it down in my notes here, that says, "Reading will help children to build a better world than their parents have known." So these books and stories subtly put that pressure on children. I don't mean pressure in a negative way. It's an observation. I'm not arguing about the goodness or or what bothers us about this. It's just an observation that is what is happening. So again, I want you, in the literary way, or with a literary mindset, I want you to be looking at the text and say, what does the text say about what the author or the people of this time period believe childhood is like or should be like? And here's Grace Lavery's quote. "We will not then," she's talking to her class, "make generalizations about what children are, what children like, or what children know," because we're acknowledging our distance from childhood. "But we will wonder together whether the inverse is true too, and that something in the infantile attachments we feel towards children's literature might also resist conscription into the normative mechanisms of maturity." So there, she's also sort of alluding to, what is it about adulthood that draws us to children's literature? Why do we find so much joy in it? I want to expand on this discussion and mention a YouTube dialogue. It was like an academic chat that took place between two authors and academics, Michael Rosen and Daniel Hahn. And Daniel Hahn specifically said something interesting in the talk. It was titled, "Is Children's Literature Taken Seriously?" And he was arguing that it needs to be, that it's not just immature, like the YA young adult video said. It's not just kid lit. It shouldn't be dismissed. It's as prestigious as any other kind of literature and as worthy of discussion and analysis and appreciation and whatnot. It's not a lesser art form. But he said what's interesting about children's literature is that children, especially younger children, it's not so much the case for older children, they don't choose the books for themselves. So if you're an author for nursery rhymes through, or just the nursery age through, I don't even know what age, but you're the one going to the bookstore and deciding which books you want to present to the reader. In most other genres, the readers pull the book off the shelf themselves. They go to the reading list and pick out which book they want to buy and read that year. And so that is what makes this really fascinating, is that it's very convoluted. It is a child and an adult audience participating in the perpetuation of this genre, very literally. Like the profits are driven by the adult and the child. So those are just some things to keep in mind, just the role that adults play in the perceptions of and perpetuation of what this genre has become, is, and will become. So I want you to be thinking about your own ideas of childhood and to acknowledge that you might think right now that that's just what everybody thinks about childhood because that's what childhood is. That's what it's supposed to be. But really, we are products of history and historical evolution and evolution of thought and philosophy and psychology. And so what we believe about childhood is very based upon all of this history. And what we purchase and share with children, what we perpetuate, will shape children's literature of the future and ultimately the narrative that we feed to children about what their child experiences are supposed to be like. I think that all of that is so interesting. And so what I want to do next is read a few really popular and important, you could even say canonized, in literary realms. The canon is like, when you say, I've read the classics, it's like the 100 most important books. And canons are complicated, and we'll talk about that more mid-quarter. Yet, there does exist somewhat of a literary canon for children's literature, and I want to look at a few of those canonized texts, specifically from the 21st century, and talk about and analyze the attitudes of childhood that are embedded into those texts, and really break them down, Sherlock Holmes them, in order to discover not what is true necessarily about childhood, but what does the book capture about childhood, perpetuate about childhood, all that good stuff. All right, you guys, enjoy this.